All right, well, in just a few minutes, we'll get underway with what you've come to see this afternoon. One of the top three comics of the 1920s, Harold Lloyd, the fellow with the horn-rimmed glasses, the shy boy that always manages to get the girl in the end through cleverness and brains. But there's always some hair-raising stuff that goes on during the film, and usually some sort of a great big chase or something like that that goes on. Well, the whole last 25 minutes of this film are a big chase. So hold on to your hat, you'll want to drink water so you don't get exhausted as that's all going on. Before we get underway about that, I always like to mention a few things about the silent picture era and the theaters and the organs and the scoring of these films. Well, this all got underway at the tail end of the last century, not the 20th century, but the 19th century, when films were created and they were simply motion for the sake of motion. And you could go to the fair, and there was a little box called a kinetoscope that you'd put your penny in or your nickel in, and the light would come on, and you'd look at it, and you'd turn the crank, and perhaps there would be a butterfly spreading its wings, or perhaps there would be an exotic lady doing a dance step. And that's what film was all about at that time. And nobody thought too much about it. It was just sort of a passing fancy. But of course, it developed as time went on, and eventually they wound up doing something called Hale's Tours, where they would bring around a car that looked like a railroad car. And everybody would pile in that, and on one end of it there would be a screen, and the other end a projector. Then they would show films of faraway places that you could pretend that you were actually traveling in that railroad car to these exotic climates somewhere else in the country or in the world. Well, it didn't take too long before somebody figured that something else needed to happen with these little tiny short films that really didn't mean much. And that happened around 1910 with a picture called, what was it called? The Great Train Robbery. And that was the first film in America that had a funny little thing that we call a plot that began to advance what was going on. Still, it was a short film. Still, the theaters that these films were shown in were tiny little storefront boxes. They were called Nickelodeons, and they usually were converted out of a storefront, maybe even just for the evening, where they would hang a bed sheet on the wall, a projector at the other end. They would borrow 50 or 100 or 200 chairs from the funeral parlor next door, subject to instant recall, of course. And they would show these films. You paid a nickel to get in. Nickel and odium, the Greek word that meant theater. That's where this all started. Well, the films were silent. And in these days, sometimes we have to say, why would you create a film with no sound anyhow? We're asked that question. Well, the answer to that is they hadn't yet figured out how to put sound on film. And so when these silent pictures came around to the local Nickelodeons, it was incumbent on a local musician to create a score, play some music for it, rather than it being just silent. It was much, much better that way. Well, initially, just like the films, nobody much cared. And Aunt Susie from down the street at the Baptist church would come in for the afternoon, and she would play favorite hymns, or Hearts and Flowers, or a bit of the William Tell Overture on the upright piano. And usually while holding a conversation and having tea with the church ladies that had come to spend the afternoon with her. And sometimes the music didn't particularly go with it. The William Tell was being played while the lovers were kissing, and sometimes the Hearts and Flowers was being played while the horses were running. So, but again, it didn't matter a whole lot at that point. Everybody had a good time. Everything was fine. But along about 1915-16, Hollywood began to grow up, and there became great directors and stars. People like D.W. Griffith that created Intolerance and Birth of a Nation, films that were 2 hours long, 3 hours, that were telling epic stories. And they suddenly became very interested in what music was being used to score their pictures, because they knew that the music was fully 50% of what the audience got out of an afternoon or an evening at the moving picture show. The musician down front could lift that picture out of the ordinary and add the third dimension to it. They could manipulate the audience's emotions, and sadness and happiness, and just all kinds of things. Or if they didn't pay any attention to what was going on in the film, they could ruin that picture as well. So Hollywood became very interested in what sort of music went out, and they began to provide suggestions, and in some cases, a complete score. Well, in those days, the theaters showed the films 5 times a day, and they changed the title 3 times a week of what was on the screen. Imagine yourself the pianist or the organist of a theater and being brought 250 pages on Sunday night at 11 o'clock, being told that tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock you have to be able to play all of this music and manipulate the organ or the piano and keep an eye on the screen and don't you miss any of those cues. Well, that wasn't likely to happen. So they created what they call a cue sheet. And that's what most of us use to this very day to cue these silent pictures. It was something that, quite often, you put together yourself, or you could use the one that came with the film from Hollywood. It was sort of a roadmap, if you will, to keep you moving in a forward direction, and how you accompanied that picture. It gave particular scenes, particular things of interest, cues, important things that you didn't want to miss, sound effects, and so on. And it suggested what music you used for a scene and how long that scene was, and it gave you 4 or 5 or 6 measures of a lead line of that music so you would know how it went. Well, most of the musicians had huge music libraries. They would go to those and they would pick out that piece. They would find it and they would utilize it, or maybe they thought there was something they liked better to use for a particular scene, and so they would put together their own music and their own cue sheets. And that's how it was done, principally in the 19-teens and 20s. Well, by the mid-teens, organs began to be transplanted into theaters. First of all, it was church organs. They weren't very successful. And somebody came up, Robert Hope Jones, with what he called a unit orchestra, which became known as the theater organ. And that's what this is, a Wurlitzer Hope Jones unit orchestra. It was the world's first synthesizer, and being installed in chambers on both sides of the room, even though it was a pipe organ, it was the world's first stereo as well. And they were ideal for accompanying the silent films. They were all the rage, and many different manufacturers made them, and there were over 10,000 of them installed in theaters by the end of the 20s. If you were a theater organist back then, well, you could name your price for playing the pictures. The most popular of all of the theater organists who played in 1926 at the New York Paramount Theater on Times Square made over $60,000 a year playing the theater organ. Well, some things have changed over the years, including that. But at any rate, the idea is the same. And we utilize then the resources of the unit orchestra to synthesize a symphony, playing along for the pictures. Why did they do this? Because in those days, as it would be today, having an orchestra of 10 or 20 or 40 or 110 musicians like they had at the Roxy Theater in New York was an expensive proposition for 5 shows a day, 7 days a week. And they found that a good theater organist and a good theater organ could do the job just as well and maybe even better. Well, when the pictures learned to talk about 1927, people went out of work that played for pictures all over the place, and many of them moved west, and they went with the motion picture studios, and they taught the new pictures all about scoring as well. And that's the same scoring that was going on all through the silent picture era, and it's the same scoring that goes on to this very day with pictures. That music that tells you what's happening, what's coming, who the hero is, who the bad guy is. All of that sort of thing still goes on. And if you think about it, imagine your favorite picture, whether it might be Titanic or Star Wars or Gone with the Wind or whatever it might be, with no music. The vision of Scarlett O'Hara standing in the scorched earth out back of Tara eating a turnip under a dead tree isn't anywhere near as romantic without Max Steiner's immortal music that went with it. Well, it was theater organists, for the most part, that lent their talents to scoring those pictures. And 2 of the best known, one went with Disney and wound up doing all of the music for the Dumbo cartoon, the full-length feature Dumbo, and the Ferdinand the Bull cartoons, and also orchestrating the immortal Fantasia. His name was Oliver Wallace. And maybe the best known of all of them was a fellow named Carl Stalling. He went with Warner Brothers. And if you've ever seen a Warner Brothers cartoon, watched Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck and Porky Pig cavorting around on the screen, all of that music put together, that crazy music in the background, was the work of a theater organist from Kansas City that played a Wurlitzer organ just like this. So it's the same thing that goes on to this very day, and in a very brief nutshell, That's the history of silent pictures and scoring and how these organs came to be. And that's what we're going to try to practice this afternoon. That I've written out a cue sheet. Most of the scores are missing, gone from the Harold Lloyd pictures these days, and so you have to do it yourself. I like to do these comedies somewhat Warner Brothers style, title recognition. If you're old enough, you're going to recognize a bunch of pieces in this whole thing. So Long Mary is the piece that we use when Mary appears on the whole thing, and there are any number of other pieces, right down to Saint-Saëns the Swan, that you might recognize as we go along, to heighten the action and to magnify what's going on the great silver screen. So that is just about it. We'll take an intermission partway through, then give you a chance to stretch, and then we will come back with the hair-raising finale. And so, as they used to say then back in the day, and now, settle back in the perfumed twilight of this wonderful old electric pleasure dome and enjoy our feature presentation for this afternoon. Harold Lloyd in Girl Shy. Thanks again so much for being with us today.